defined as a security balance. Each side feels threatened by the other. Each side's defensive actions is aggressive by the other side. It's becomes very expensive, very difficult to generate any gesture of conciliation or of compromise to the other. And if a gesture can be made, it tends to look like a Trojan horse to the other side, not like an olive branch. Nowhere is this syndrome more dangerous than in the Taiwan Strait. And, both parties, Beijing and Washington, claim to be acting to maintain the status quo. And I think the fact is that, if you're honest, both sides are kind of playing fast and loose with the status quo. That Americans are forgetting history, if Americans ever really knew history, with some notable exceptions, of course.
I am American.
And the Chinese are rewriting history for their own political benefits. I think that not just the Taiwan situation itself, but by extension, the underpinning of the U.S.-China relationship is being put at some risk here. The Shanghai Communique, and by extension, the U.S.-China relationship, and I say this as an amateur, not as a sinologist, it's founded on ambiguity over the status of Taiwan. There's been a tug of war over that question from the very outset of U.S.-China, U.S.-PRC relations. The one China policy, as you know, is not the one China principle, and vice versa. But notwithstanding that, the U.S.-China relationship was able to flourish, and frankly, the cross-strait relationship was, at least for a time, able to flourish. I think, underneath all the ambiguity was a pretty simple set of propositions that Beijing would not use force to achieve unification, that the U.S. would not support Taiwan independence, and that Taiwan wouldn't foreclose at least the possibility of eventual peaceful reconciliation. But obviously a lot has changed. I mean, to state the obvious, the democratic Taiwan of today is not the Republic of China of the 1970s or the 1980s. The PRC of today is not the weak developing country than it was. It's not even the country that it was 15 years ago under Hu Jintao. But I think the most important change is just the catastrophic loss of trust between the parties, the loss of patience. And that is on top, of course, of a major shift in the power differential between China and the United States. So as a result, it feels like Chinese leaders seem to think that, number one, that they have now the ability to coerce Taiwan. They can force Taiwan to submit to PRC rules somewhat along the lines of Hong Kong. And secondly, conviction that that Washington and Taipei are really conspiring to engineer a permanent separation that turns Taiwan into a strategic asset from which the United States can project power, can harass China, can block it, threaten it. And that creates a sense that maybe there's some urgency to making a move, to finishing the job of national reunification, of unification before it's too late. So what is it that we think we know about the Party Congress? What is it that we can reasonably expect? And again, to repeat, I'm speaking not as a bona fide sinologist, but as a foreign policy practitioner. But from where I sit, I think it's very obvious that Xi Jinping has effectively laid the groundwork for a decisive win, political win.
You're putting your bet on him?
Yeah. I think the Ladbroke odds go the other way, but he's orchestrated a very methodical campaign of personal aggrandizement. He dramatically launched, and I watched this, the relentless anti-corruption drive, which was not the campaign that I and others, I think, expected. It's a permanent institution. He sidelined the state, the bureaucracy, in a fairly extraordinary way through the creation of these party leading groups that are answer to him. I think he came in demonstrating a mastery of internal party politics. He tweaked a lot of the processes. He rewrote the norms. He's certainly shown himself to be unafraid to take some big risks and to place some big bets. And there's every reason to think that that bet is going to pay off next week at the party congress. I think that also that it's fair to say that the party congress, first and foremost, is really about personnel. And I don't doubt that Xi Jinping has had to make all kinds of deals and concessions and compromises that we may never learn about. There are a lot of factions, there are a lot of interest groups, stakeholders. Dictators have politics too. It's not just democracies. But I think this is the widely held view, that Xi Jinping, by and large, is going to get most of the people that he wants in the places he wants them, and that he's going to sideline most of the people that he doesn't want. There may be people that get elevated that weren't his first choice. There may be some leaving that he would love to hold on to, but it's going to play out according to his plan, by and large. Now, I'm not dumb enough to make predictions about who is going to land where and so on, but I will predict, going out on a limb here, that the defining characteristic of the new Standing Committee of the Politburo, the new Politburo itself, is going to be the preponderance of cadre who have either demonstrated their loyalty or at least pledged their loyalty to Xi Jinping. And in my view, that opens the door to what I'd kind of call the Putin problem, or the classic sort of dictator syndrome, that the more absolute the power is, the longer that they rule, the more bias there is in their information flows, the more distortion there is in their decision making. Even just working as a lowly special assistant to the president in the NSC, I saw it takes guts to contradict the president or to argue against the center of gravity in the Situation Room. And it's not normally a brilliant career strategy unless you're really good at it. I think it's a much more unforgiving system in China than even in the Obama White House. So I'm highly sensitized to the fact that the people around the leader are selected and flourish by and large based on their ability to tell the leader what they think is going to please him. And to make themselves look good. And that's a hallmark of a Leninist system. That certainly wasn't the case in the Obama administration, of course, but simply saying that there is a tractor beam, there's a power to power that makes it very difficult to sometimes be honest. So this is a huge risk factor in any authoritarian system, and it's exacerbated, I think, by the very Leninist approach that we've seen in Xi, this contempt for the bureaucracy, this predilection for a more monarchical style of policymaking that's centered around him and rooted in loyalty. So in terms of policy, the 20th Party Congress, I don't think that you really need to be a fortune teller to see what's coming. Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party have laid out blueprint after blueprint in even just the past year or two. So there's no shortage of authoritative clues about the direction of his third term. You've got the third resolution on history. You've got the 14th five-year plan on the economy, the recent white paper on Taiwan, a white paper on democracy, Xi Jinping's Boao speech on foreign policy, his speech to the Central Economic Work Conference, there's the Common Prosperity Campaign, the dual circulation concept, global development initiative, and so on. Well, I gather that the Congress is expected to produce some policy statements on a few specific issues, but overall, I think there's so much out there that I've got to believe that some enterprising graduate student couldn't use like machine learning or something to basically write Xi Jinping's report to the Congress and get it like 90 in the 95% category. I mean, in fact, we could play 20th Party Congress bingo right now. Sort of Xi Jinping thought. Give me a speech, Xi Jinping thought. Give me a socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era, right? Give me realize the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. Give me the changes unseen in a century. So, you know, maybe you don't even need AI. I mean, you can just do this with refrigerator magnets and sort of write a speech for them. All right, so what should we look for in Xi Jinping's third term? Well, I think, again, I'm going back to the past, not the future, but I think it's important to take stock of what we've seen and what we've learned about Xi Jinping. You know, I remember past predictions that the kinder, gentler Xi Jinping was just around the corner. That after he'd been in office for a couple of years, or after he sort of passed the 19th Party Congress, you know, that we were going to see him come into his reformist true self. And you know what? Like that hasn't happened, and it ain't gonna happen. Xi Jinping didn't dial it down after the 19th Party Congress. He doubled down, and he's gotten even more muscular in his approach, even more repressive, frankly, in his approach. I'm not saying that he hasn't made tactical adjustments and retreats, but I think it'd be very hard to argue that Xi Jinping has made or is gonna make, inclined to make strategic reversals. I mean, go no further than the zero COVID campaign. So in my view, he's very certain and very clear about his goal of safeguarding the system and achieving the mystical state of national rejuvenation. My first experience with Xi Jinping was in 2011 when I accompanied then Vice President Biden to China as part of an agreement engineered by our mutual friend and my former boss, Jeff Bader, between Obama and Hu Jintao, that the two vice presidents should get to know each other. We had the luxury of knowing that Xi Jinping was heir apparent. He was in line to take the reins from Hu Jintao, but we did not know much about him, and we felt he didn't know much about the United States either. So the decision was made to invest in an extended visit by Biden, and we went with a very, very small group. Biden's assistant principal advisor, foreign policy advisor at the time, was a certain Tony Blinken. And we spent a day or two in Beijing, and then we traveled together to Chengdu in Sichuan province. And the two men had a lot of time together. And both of them, I felt, and still feel, are fairly extraordinary politicians. And were hugely curious about the other, and I've also felt were quite forthcoming over time in these conversations about what they thought. And Biden, as a great politician, would ask, like, what keeps you up at night? Those kinds of open-ended questions. And Xi Jinping, at that point, not general secretary yet, not vice president, not president, and still very interested in both communicating, but also in learning about how the US government dealt with certain kinds of problems. I thought he was pretty forthcoming. And one of the things that I vividly remember about the early conversations in Chengdu was his description of China as being beset by threats from within, that China's natural state was kind of entropy, that there were forces within China that were constantly pulling it apart and bringing it down, ethnic divides, factional divides, religious and geographic divide, whatever it was, that China was at risk of kind of melting down at any given moment if there was not a unitary, strong, coherent leadership. And that's the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, and that the party itself was at risk. This was just shortly after the tail end of the Arab Spring, and he talked at length about the Ba'athist parties and what they had failed to do in terms of policing themselves, cleansing themselves, remaining in touch with the people, leading the people. He also described China's external situation as equally dire, that China was perpetually under threat from foreign sources that sought to divide China, undermine it, undergrade it. And this was not an argument. He wasn't criticizing the United States and so on. He was conveying a mindset. And the punchline here was China needs the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese Communist Party needs a single strong leader. That collective leadership, factionalism, I remember the interpreter, Jim Brown, used the phrase mountaintopism, okay? That factionalism was putting the stability of China, the future of China at risk. And this was what kept him up at night. This is what he was faced with. And sure enough, when he took office, we've seen evidence now. I mean, look no further than the concept of comprehensive security. Comprehensive security is rooted in comprehensive insecurity, right? This paranoia being a feature of Leninism, in part because the system lacks the sort of cleansing cyclical refresh of its legitimacy that you get from electoral contests, whatever the failure and shortcoming of elections may be. So, number one, Xi Jinping grabbed the sword, internal security. And you know what? He's not going to let go. He institutionalized the anti-corruption drive, as I said, made it a powerful, coercive tool, which, among many other things, completely shattered the tradition of the party elders kind of ruling from the shadows. And it effectively decimated the other factions within the party. The list of the senior cadre that have been purged is breathtaking.
Everyone we dealt with is in jail. Really, military,
Right.
civilian, domestic security, everything.
He has been amazingly successful in subordinating the security services to him under the, under this framework of comprehensive national security and the Central National Security Commission. The Politburo enacted these 5-year national security strategies. They've renewed it. You see the NGO law, you see the cybersecurity law, you see the Strike Hard campaign in Xinjiang. There's been huge spending on domestic security, outstrips their military spending, apparently. And you've got now surveillance technology and analytic tools for maintaining social order that no dictator in history has ever had access to. And it's comprehensive. It's not only security at home, and you see external operations like Operation Skyhook, Operation Foxhound, this extraterritorial enforcement of party rules. Secondly, Xi Jinping grasped the pen, propaganda, and he's not going to let go of that either. So look at the third resolution on history, enshrining Xi Jinping thought and effectively elevating him to putting him beyond criticism, let's put it that way, because to criticize China, criticize Xi Jinping, now that Xi Jinping thought is enshrined in the Constitution, is to criticize the party, to criticize China. He's created this kind of multi-dimensional system of information and control and propaganda, patriotic education, ideological indoctrination, the Xi Jinping Thought app, which Tom and I both have on our phones.
I don't even need it anymore.
Don't you have to take a test every
That's what you
week?
turn on.
Social responsibility score. I'm sure you score high on that. Full spectrum censorship, re-education indoctrination centers in Xinjiang, etc. But it's not only propaganda, not only censorship. The party has developed the ability to spot sources of social discontent and to respond not just by brute force, but by presenting itself as the solution, a patriotic solution to these problems, depicting itself as the defender of the nation, defender of the mainstream against external forces, or arguably maybe a small diluted minority within China that's corrupt or that's hostile or that's somehow kind of un-Chinese. They put, and Xi himself puts huge importance on narrative power, again with an external dimension, seeking to control how outsiders talk about China and how they talk about China's core interests, defining China's engagement with the West in terms of fighting spirit of diplomats and struggle in international affairs. And thirdly, Xi Jinping grasped the gun, the military, and he's not letting go of that either. He has taken complete control of the Central Military Commission. He has reorganized and streamlined the command structure of the PLA. He's subordinated the PLA and the People's Armed Police to the party and to him. He's investing heavily in military modernization, a military that can fight and win wars. And I think it's relevant to point out the linkage between China's domestic security and its external national security and foreign policy, not just in these extraterritorial operations, but because the trend has been towards a growing projection of Chinese power, of influence, security abroad, much more proactive, much more internationalist and interventionist, I should say, interventionist approach abroad. So some of that is eminently logical. You see it driven by China's economic growth, which has magnified its international exposure, has magnified its international interests, obviously, foreign markets, sources of raw material. China has a lot invested in the world now. But at this year's Boao Forum, we heard Xi Jinping unveil his new global security initiative. And while it's vague, as all these initiatives are at the outset, it's got a clear theme. And the theme, which I think is a shift from more traditional Chinese foreign policy, is to directly challenge the role of the United States and the US alliances in global security. We're seeing, I think, a China that's working to alter global governance structures in ways that fit the interests of the Chinese Communist Party, making the world safe for authoritarianism with Chinese characteristics, and maybe with a few Russian characteristics thrown in, maybe a Iranian and a North Korean characteristic to boot. So there are a lot of clues in the areas where China is working to reform the international system, and the ways that it has, in my view at least, co-opted international organizations, including parts of the United Nations, and taken ownership and in some ways redefined the UN Charter itself. I mean, we just saw last week the inability of the UN Human Rights Council to get an agreement to even debate the issue of human rights in Xinjiang, okay? So I don't think that China is proselytizing its political system the way that the US does, like trying to export democracy, or the way that, you know, the Soviet Union tried to push communism. Xi Jinping's not Trotsky. But he has begun to talk increasingly about a China model, and we're hearing a lot more from Beijing emphasizing its success in maintaining social order when it talks to the international community. And it's not just talk either. You know, with the export of safe cities, surveillance technology, counterterrorism training, the expansion of the Ministry of Public Security and the People's Armed Police, international engagement, their deployment, etc. And just the character of Chinese diplomacy and commercial outreach, Belt and Road, that's, you know, very proudly non-judgmental and amoral, if I can put it that way. And we've seen the banner of dual circulation, of Made in China 2025, of China Standards 2035. These reflect Xi Jinping's ambition to make China a more self-reliant economy and free itself from dependence on foreign technology, foreign inputs, while making the world more dependent on China's market and China's manufacturing. And under the label of common prosperity, I think we've seen also a more distributive or redistributive approach, including forced philanthropy by entrepreneurs that aims at sort of blunting some of the sharp edges of the wealth gap. Anyway, not to belabor this, but my point here is just this, that I think there's no shortage of roadside indicators, of markers that spell out in the midterm and maybe the longer term what the objectives are that we can reasonably expect to set the strategic direction of China in a third term for Xi Jinping. I will add the caveat, though, that we have to be a little cautious because the tactical side of China's behavior under Xi Jinping is a different story. And I think, I mean, I, for one, will admit that I've been surprised by Xi Jinping more than once, and never on the upside, I will also add. So lastly, this is taking a long time, I know, sorry.
That's right.
What is Xi Jinping up against in his third term? Because that's the other part of the equation beyond what it is that he intends or wants. The economy, not Xi Jinping's strong suit. Avoiding the middle income trap, sustaining, improving growth. Remember his pledge back in 2020 to double the size of the Chinese economy by 2035. Well, how's that going? De-risking the financial sector, the immense problem of debt, rebalancing the economy towards consumption, not going the right way now, moving manufacturing up the value chain, managing the real estate crisis, dealing with the slowing global economy, the phenomenon of increasingly active diversification by foreign firms, if diversification in some cases really divestiture, where firms are reducing their footprint or backing out of China, plus responding to the various restrictions imposed by Beijing or by Washington, other factors that are reducing foreign investment. Then there's the corner that he has painted himself into with the dynamic zero COVID policy, having a huge negative impact on the economy. Plus, you got the aging population, the mismatch in the age pyramid, inadequate social security system, youth unemployment, the wealth gap. You've got food security, which is exacerbated by the Ukraine war, by overfishing and unregulated fishing. You've got real water concerns in the country, not just water pollution, you've got soil pollution, air pollution, and so on. Xi Jinping has put forward ambitious decarbonization goals, good on him. But if China is to actually implement them, they're going to prove to be phenomenally expensive. And then there's the fallout from the crackdown on the tech sector, the crackdown on entrepreneurship. That's put a real chill on private sector activity and investment. And then there are problems which I don't entirely understand in China's technology push, which is, really at the heart of the Xi Jinping administration's economic and security strategy. So I have a very healthy appreciation for the brilliance and the innovative power of Chinese scientists and Chinese engineers. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about that. But look at the priority campaign to reproduce, to develop an indigenous mRNA vaccine, for example. Look at the push to develop an indigenous semiconductor design and production capacity. I'm not saying any of these are easy, but Beijing has poured tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars into crash campaigns. And in the case of semiconductors, not only has it fallen very far short of its targets, what are they doing now? They're having a massive purge, anti-corruption campaign, punishing people for because the money's disappeared. Anyway. Then there are the external challenges. I put at the very top of the list that from Beijing's perspective, Taiwan is trending the wrong way. There is escalating military activity, escalating risks around Taiwan. Both the United States and other US partners are getting more and more involved there. And certainly attitudes in Taiwan are, if anything, souring on the mainland. Xi Jinping's got a big albatross around his neck, Vladimir Putin, right? Remember February 4th? There are limits apparently in that relationship. Something I've worked a lot on connected with Belt and Road has shown me that the massive scale of third world debt that China is holding and can't collect. This is a huge problem. And then there is unprecedented level of just plain old pushback against China, pushback from the US, but pushback from Japan and Australia and the West generally, and some of the fence sitters as well. There was a moment, remember the golden era not long ago when Beijing was sitting pretty with the Europeans. And now this craven Europe, naive Europe, is a very different place, particularly after Putin's invasion of the Ukraine. There's no more 16+1. There's no more hope of co-opting the Eastern Europeans. And frankly, after all of China's military saber rattling in Taiwan, even after the Russia-Ukraine war is ended and forgotten, there's no real prospect that attitudes will go back to normal. And I don't think that China is going to have much luck coaxing Germany and the others back to the golden era. Lastly, political challenges. And just put it simply, Xi Jinping has got at some point to figure out what to do about succession. There is a real price to be had for not being willing to groom a successor or even to indicate what that process is going to look like. And then there's the trade-off. I realize that as a good Marxist, he thrives in contradictions, but there is a contradiction between political governance, the centralized party control, and professional governance, delegating to competent technocrats to implement policy and make decisions. And then, as I mentioned before, the dictator bubble syndrome in a highly centralized decision-making system. Anyway, there's a lot of ground that I haven't covered that gets at the U.S.-China relations in the period ahead. I haven't talked about the U.S. midterms. I haven't talked about the prospects of the Xi Jinping-Biden summit, but I have been speaking for a long time. So I will stop here and turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Danny. That was a tour de force. You covered a lot of ground. There's a lot of things for people to ask about. I wanted to ask the first question about where you left off, because I can't think of a more experienced person who's to answer this question, which is how important is a upcoming President Biden, President Xi summit? That's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, if you were advising President Biden, as you've advised President Obama about the summit, what would you press him to try to accomplish, and what would you temper his expectations about in terms of accomplishments? And a somewhat unrelated question, but it's related to whether the summit will happen. A lot of tension in the U.S.-China relationship that you laid out so well at the beginning of your talk. Recent Commerce Department restrictions on high-tech microchips and production capabilities for high-tech microchips on China. Where do you think the red lines are in Beijing for just how many measures like that before November can be raised by the United States before Beijing says, never mind, no summit? So maybe answer those in reverse order. So, like, will the summit happen? If it happens, what should happen at it? And how important will it be over the long run? Is it just a stabilizing thing? Can you really build a foundation for something constructive? And what would you advise the president to say and expect and seek? Wow. There aren't that many people who come here, who've actually done this. So
yeah. Well, red lines are tough because they tend to be situational, and sometimes embarrassment counts for more than genuine national security concerns or outrage in political decision-making about something like a leaders' summit. But I'd say, Tom, we're in deep, deep pink.
So we're getting into the red zone.
Yes. 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 We're like coming up to magenta or somewhere in that vicinity. There's not a lot of room left before I think the idea of actually sitting down together becomes untenable, certainly from, and I mean, on the part of Xi Jinping and China. Nevertheless, my read, talking not only to my former colleagues and friends in Washington, but also talking to former counterparts in Beijing by admittedly virtual means, and also from what I got from Wang Yi and others when they were in New York. My read is that as of a week ago, both sides wanted the meeting to happen. Although each side wants the other to want it more than they do and to cast themselves in the position of being the gracious party that assents to the request by the demandeur of the other side. But that's not an unfamiliar game, particularly in US-China relations. So I think that each leader and each government wants a meeting for their own reasons, in part because each side harbors the conviction that, number one, only the top leader in the other system really matters. And there's a strong body of evidence that US officials can muster for why that seems to be true in China. But also, I think because there is a genuine concern about the high risk of an unintended crisis and conflict that I believe neither Xi Jinping nor Biden had any interest in any kind of military conflict between the US and China. But I also believe that both understand that that is a real risk now, that there is simply so much adrenaline and so many military assets moving so fast in such close proximity, and there are third parties in the mix, including Taiwan, that it wouldn't take much for something to go wrong. Lord knows it's happened before. A certain EP3 incident, don't want to give you PTSD. But I mean, just imagine if an incident like that were to occur today. It was tough in 2001. Today, it would be seemingly impossible to manage. So I think that there are reasons that they want to stabilize the relationship in the near term. I also have witnessed the growth of the Joe Biden, Xi Jinping personal relationship, and I don't want to overdo it. I don't want to romanticize it, but there really is something there. I mean, leaders, as you know, leaders matter. Leaders are human, and their relationships matter. Now, I'm not for a moment forgetting that Xi Jinping is a hard-bitten communist Leninist leader who's out for the interests of the party and the nation, and something very similar, minus the Leninist part, can be said about Joe Biden. So, you know, this isn't a date, but they have a real relationship. And not only is that a net plus, an asset in international relations, it's the only thing we have going for us at this point. We have shredded every other thread of engagement, certainly in the last 5 or 6 years. And without a doubt, Xi Jinping is the decision maker. And the Chinese side had absolutely convinced them. Well, I was about to say they've convinced themselves, but that's probably not accurate. The Chinese side is asserting that Joe Biden, President Biden, is the person who matters. And they have addressed all of their bile and anger at his advisors. They have locked onto this evil consigliere theory that everything is the fault of the bad advisors around Biden, who reached an understanding in these virtual meetings with Xi Jinping, who gave the much vaunted 5 no's, but whose people in practice are not unswervingly implementing the will of the president in the United States the way that they do in China. So both sides are focused on the leader. I think the leaders know each other well and have a real relationship that they can build on. There's nothing else in the U.S.-China relationship that that works. And yeah, so I think that a summit is very important. I think it's really the last best hope of the relationship now.
So what do you tell them though? You have to write the one pager saying, here are the 5 things you should address and try to achieve. What should you try to address and achieve?
Well, first of all, I think that we should set aside our impulse to address and achieve.
Okay. So the first thing is scrap the question.
When we look back at the notably unsuccessful and unfortunate Anchorage meeting, the first meeting, I mean, much of the problem was the decision to hold the meeting in public before it actually began.
Yeah, geez.
But the fact is that if there's one thing I've learned, youngins, like now I'm sounding like a crotchety old ex-diplomat, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that diplomacy is not debate. To have an argument is to lose in diplomacy. You don't want to out-argue the other side. You want to persuade the other side. And for the United States to begin every meeting, as we typically do, with our bill of attainder, our shopping list, it's like, hey, stupid.
Deliverables.
Right. Stop doing this. Boom, 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 boom. Right. And start producing some value, right? Yeah, hatch an egg here. Give me something. Give me something to work with here.
I gotta bring home something.
I think that the mission of the US president is to stop the downward spiral. And this is a high G death spiral that we're in with a lot of momentum. It is not going to be easy. I think this is a meeting, first of all, that needs to be a full day. It has to build in time to, for each side present their talking points, each side present their rebuttal points, each side reject the rebuttal of the other side, take a break, have a meal, go for a walk, sit down somewhere on a bench and have a talk. What the hell is going on? What is it that you are really trying to do? Where is there space? How can we avoid getting trapped in a dilemma, not to mention in conflict? This cannot be done in the usual sort of 90-minute session on the margins of a big conference in a conference room in Bali. No.
Chandeliers.
They have to, they have to dedicate some real time to it. And I think that there should only be one deliverable from the meeting. And that is a decision, a commitment that the designated authoritative team of Joe Biden, whoever that person or people are, and the designated authoritative team representing Xi Jinping, whoever that person and people may be, and I don't think it's going to be Yang Jiechi, that they be directed and empowered to hold ongoing conversation, and that the focus of that conversation should be twofold. Number one is reducing the risk of an unintended, undesired crisis between the US and China. And secondly, working to try to put out of bounds of US-China competition some of the priority areas of global responsibility areas where the United States and China have an obligation to the world to stop undercutting each other, at a minimum to deconflict, if not ideally to cooperate in some fashion, to collaborate in some fashion. Maybe public health is still too politicized in the aftermath of COVID, but there are other areas of development, food security, climate resilience, etc., where we both want the same thing, and the world wants the same things from both of us. So ruling those areas a safe place for cooperation, I think, would be important. Now, what I will mention, what I would also tell the president is that his guardrails metaphor isn't working. That I've heard again and again, and he will undoubtedly hear from Xi Jinping, some version of the, you want guardrails, but the real problem is that this is a one-way street and you're driving the wrong way.
At 100 miles an hour.
Right.
It's a seatbelt
Right.
for someone who drives
Yes,
irresponsibly.
exactly. That this is a seatbelt that will give you more comfort to do the very things that we object to you doing. So why on earth would we do it? So I think there needs to be a rethink, not just of the metaphor, but how we present the challenge of working to reduce risk when neither we nor the Chinese are going to back off an inch in asserting our rights. And that includes our rights for our militaries to operate.
Okay, thanks. Open it up. Oh, over here.
Thanks so much for your session. My question is, I was really struck by your framing of the 2011 Biden meeting in China. I was just listening to, there's like an economist podcast about the second kind of
Oh yeah, David Rennie.
and to the morning, the journalist talks about this very same meeting, and it's kind of, you know, at the end of the whole trip, there's like a small dinner with maybe four of them, they have a forthcoming conversation. And what struck me from both of those two framings of this meeting was A, Xi Jinping's kind of paranoia, and B, his, I guess, on the other hand, like his eagerness to learn, whether that's from the Arab Spring or from the whole Soviet Union. But it strikes me from what you're saying, him going into his third term, that he's increasingly surrounded by loyalists. He's increasingly, you know, in this Leninist system, which does kind of breed this paranoia. So it seems like, you know, on the other hand, he doesn't really have much capacity or time to learn or to kind of, new ways of thinking about things. So it seems pretty pessimistic, right? He's on the one hand likely to become more paranoid, and on the other hand, less likely to be able to learn kind of the right lessons from whether that's what Putin's doing in Ukraine or otherwise. So I don't know if is that something you would agree with, or do you see maybe some glimmers of them for the third term?
Well, I certainly worry that what if we call it paranoia or we call it vigilance, maybe depends on our attitude about Leninism and about the Chinese Communist Party. But I certainly worry that what was maybe a theoretical concern about the threats from abroad has over the last 5 years been translated into a very graphic and fairly well documented concern that, you know what, even paranoics have enemies. The world is out to get him in some respects. Certainly, it's hard to argue with some of the renditions that one hears from Chinese scholars or elsewhere about what the world looks like from Beijing's perspective, and what the U.S. policies and the U.S. alliances and the U.S. initiatives look like from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party. he has grounds to be concerned, I think. So what may have been an abstract paranoia in the past, I think now is a hardening conviction that there is no common ground, that the US is implacably hostile, that it's actively waging a campaign to backfoot and undercut China at every turn. And if somebody like Mike Pompeo is to be believed, or heaven forbid, return to power in Washington, then that syndrome is going to be intensified. Now, as far as Xi Jinping's ability to learn, the fact that I sat in meetings with Biden early on and subsequently with Biden and Obama and Hillary and Kerry and so on does not really make me an expert. I'm not. I don't know what he's thinking. And I haven't been in a meeting with Xi Jinping since I guess the dinner he had for Obama at the Hangzhou summit, after the Hangzhou summit in 2016. So, okay, that's 6 years. So I honestly don't know, but and I was impressed by Xi Jinping's intellectual capacity, his political instincts, and so on. He really felt early on to me like a politician, somebody who knew how to draw out the other guy, who knew how to ask questions. I'm often thought that the person who wins the meeting is the one who asks the most questions and speaks the least. And he was pretty good at that, I thought, even though Biden was no slouch either. So this is a smart person, and I'm not dismissing his capacity to learn. But as I've described, I think he is subject to some syndromes that make it harder and harder for him to get an accurate and comprehensive perspective about what's going on elsewhere. That there's a lot of selective information provision and information bias. So yeah, there is plenty to worry about, and it's more likely to get worse than get better.
Thanks for your talk. So very early on, you mentioned there is a security dilemma between China and the United States. So my question is, do you think there is really a dilemma between these two countries, or there is a genuine conflict of interest between these two countries? Because security dilemma makes US-China cooperation hard, but a genuine conflict of interest would make that cooperation harder, even impossible.
I have not felt, especially in my diplomatic career, that there was irreconcilable conflict of interests between Washington and the United States.
Beijing.
I'm sorry,
Washington.
between Washington and
There's
Beijing.
definitely a conflict of interest between Washington and the United States, but that was a
That's
slip.
Speaking as a New Yorker. Right. It is an even worse one between
New York and the United States.
When I worked for Obama, he said privately and publicly more than once that the United States welcomes, and he welcomed, the peaceful rise of China, that he sought that rise to be one in which China assumed greater responsibilities commensurate with its power and so on. And that he felt that it was incumbent on the United States and the other industrialized countries to make room at the table for China, that China's voice should be held, but that China, sitting at the table, assumed certain obligations to international law, to global norms, and so on, that were legitimate expectations for China. And that wasn't just a talking point. That was really, I think, at the heart of the strategy of engagement, that there are undoubtedly areas where our interests diverge, and there are some zero-sum incompatibilities in particular areas, but no fundamental reason why planet Earth can't endure with both a United States of America and a People's Republic of China. And look, the track record of the US and the PRC has been quite encouraging over the decades. And we demonstrated that our systemic differences, our ideological differences weren't insurmountable obstacles to cooperation. It was not a secret that China was growing in strength and wealth, other indices of power. And the United States, however we might have felt about it emotionally, had, I think, come to terms with the reality, maybe not an inevitability, but it was the sort of thing that made people like Obama want to ensure that we are engaged and working to try to positively influence and shape the trajectory of China's rise, not to suppress it, not to contain it. I heard Obama say, and he clearly meant it, it wasn't the only time he said it, that the United States has more to fear from an unstable China that's beset with problems than we do from a powerful China that's feeling its oats. And I remember him kind of spinning out the scenario, like, just imagine if you had a situation in China where there were, let's just say, outflows of refugees,
Chaos, yeah.
where there was a financial meltdown. Like, try to envisage that world, and you won't have difficulty understanding why you don't want that to happen. So I don't accept the proposition that there is sort of an ineluctable, unavoidable them or us. The world is big enough for both of us, not in a sphere of influence sense, that will not work, but in terms of the ability of our societies to coexist. That said, I am in a shrinking and tiny minority holding that view.
So, Mr. Russell, you mentioned in the beginning of your speech that you think that the ultra nationalists on both sides, their view become the mainstream. Yeah, but however, that as I remember that when President Biden was elected in 2020, is that it was expected, at least by some experts or maybe widespread expectation, that Mr. Biden will reverse the hostile China policy of the Trump administration, and then back to the China policy in the Obama era. But then for the past 2 years, we have seen that things have not been going this way. And for me, it's that Mr. Biden's policy is more like Trump's policy than Obama's policy. So as the insider, once an insider in the administration, what do you think that what makes it this? Is that more accidental or more designed? Or yeah, I would like you to share your view on this question. Thank you.
Well, you're not the first person to say that the Biden administration's behavior, approach to China resembles that of the Trump administration in many respects, and maybe even more than it resembles the Obama administration. But the notion that Biden would reverse the quote unquote hostile policy and take a time machine back to the Obama era was a catastrophic misread of the US political situation by some in China. I don't know anyone in the United States, no sort of political scientist or policy person who thought that was going to happen. In fact, I will remind you that the winning candidate in 2016, Hillary Clinton, at least on popular vote terms.
He's an election denier. We have an election denier. They're everywhere.
It was well understood, including by Beijing, that had Hillary Clinton won and taken office in 2016, that her policies towards China would become much stricter, much tougher than Obama's had. In addition, it was not lost on my Chinese counterparts that from 2014, 2015, 2016, Obama's China policy had become much tougher, because the United States government had become frustrated, had become worried, had become angered by what it saw as the failure of the Chinese government to honor its pledges, to follow through on the agreements, to make reforms, to solve problems, and had gradually concluded that China, as a matter of policy, as a government, was exploiting the openness and the other characteristics, the features of the US economy, of the US system, and was not reciprocating, that there was such a lack of reciprocity, such an imbalance in the relationship, that things that had been tolerated in an earlier era when China was still a developing country and still sort of struggling, could no longer be accepted and tolerated as China emerged as a rich major global economy, as a peer to the United States in many respects. Those perceived unfair advantages could not be left unaddressed. That view evolved. It was not merely a conceit of Donald Trump. Now, admittedly, the Trump style and the Trump cabinet was aggressive and nasty and offensive towards China. There was a lot of gratuitous, in-your-face features to their policy and behavior. And that has changed. That is not a feature of the Biden administration. So I think that one aspect of the answer to your question is that the Chinese side misread US politics and held unrealistic expectations, and that the gap between those unrealistic expectations and the reality of a Biden administration in 2021, politics being what it is, and the behavior of China being what it is, has been salt on the wounds, has exacerbated unhappiness in Beijing about the United States.
I think we've seen it before. I'll just add something to Danny's excellent answer, and that is that I think there's a pattern of misreading changes in administration in the United States. So I can remember the transition from President Bush, the administration I served in, and President Obama's first term. And the Obama administration went out of its way to try to appear different than other administrations in the first year, to be particularly, I don't want to say soft, but accommodating and outreaching and looking for high-level dialogue early, and joint statements, and a spirit of cooperation. And I think that was misread in Beijing. And I think that's one of the reasons that Beijing's policies in 2010 were so non-constructive internationally and so upsetting to Americans, that the response was, oh, they need to be conciliatory because of the financial crisis. They're weaker And now we can be really assertive. And 2010 was one of the worst years in Chinese foreign policy history, going from a situation where they had a US administration that was reaching out to basically alienating everybody in China's periphery, right? And then you get to this transition between President Obama and President Trump. I can remember Chinese analysts saying, Obama's gotten tough. He had the pivot and he's trying to build alliances around us. And you have at least an element in his administration, if not the whole administration, based on ideology, export of democracy. That's a traditional American position. The Obama administration, like the Bush administration, was very much in that camp. And now you have President Trump. He's not going to be ideological at all. He's a business person. We can deal with him. And at first, he came across that way. And I think the really big thing, in addition to the trade wars, right, which is, I'll get to in a second, the trade wars, there was COVID. And it was destroying his administration. He wanted someone to blame, and he blamed China. And it became a racial thing, the China virus, right? So you're not going to have good relations with a country when you come up with the China virus, right? But it was good domestic politics in two fronts. And this is where I become pessimist. I'm a lifelong independent, right? I'm not a Democrat or Republican. I served in a Republican administration. But one of the things that makes me sad about US foreign policy is nobody's for trade anymore. So Donald Trump was a protectionist back when, he was just a private citizen, and he was a protectionist as president. The Democrats traditionally have been protectionists, right? There have been exceptions like Bill Clinton, but in general, they've been protectionists. Now everyone's protectionist. Nobody's saying we need free trade agreements, we need to bolster the WTO or multilateralism. And that's just bilateral. So it looks like hostility, but it's very difficult for anyone to go to Congress and say, I've got a proposal for a new free trade agreement. How long would that last?
They won't even try.
Yeah. So it's become baked into American domestic politics in a way that makes me sad. But I think that sometimes Chinese observers of the United States don't understand that the new administration coming isn't going to wipe the slate clean and start over. They still have to function in the same country. They still have to function with the same Congress, and they can't just do anything that they want.
I fully agree.
Yeah, go ahead.
You pass it on. Thank you. Thank you.
We're very low tech.
Sure. I'll take the mic. Hello to everyone on Zoom, and thank you for your very thoughtful remarks. My question has to do with this assumption that seemed implicit in the final part of your talk, that the Chinese side shares our concern about crisis management and managing the escalation ladder if something were to go wrong, for example, with the freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea. My reading is that the Chinese side has signaled disregard for much of this accidental risk. There was this dispute over who Lloyd Austin's proper counterpart was that prevented him from taking a meeting for 16 months. And there's China's longstanding disinterest in arms control agreements, most notably the INF, that eventually was one of the reasons why the US had to withdraw. And then most recently, after the Pelosi visit to Taiwan, there was scrapping bilateral mill conversations, which we should, I think, expect as the very bare minimum for crisis management, as supposedly retribution against the US side. So my question is, if the Chinese actually perceive an interest in managing crises, why are they sending all of these signals that they're not interested in managing crises, or that they are more willing than we are to go to the brink? Thanks very much.
I do not think the Chinese are more willing to go to the brink than we are. If there was a real risk, they were going to go over the brink. As long as the United States is the responsible party, is operating by the rule book, has de-escalation protocols and so on, then I think the Chinese side can afford to be a little edgier. And I think they have no demonstrated interest in being locked into the American system of crisis management. In addition, as Tom pointed out, they see these mechanisms not as guardrails, but as seatbelts and airbags that make it safer for the United States to do the things that they're trying to convince us not to do. So the Chinese, you could argue, to a certain extent, have the luxury of knowing that the United States has, it operates, the US military operates according to very well-developed, responsible set of procedures. That takes a certain amount of the risk out of the equation. Secondly, I think that what the Chinese leadership and the PLA is trying to convey to us is that we should be worried about a crisis. We should be worried about the risk of conflict. And the only way, the only legitimate way, the only reliable way to avoid it is to stop doing the things that we, China, don't want you to do. Get away from our periphery. Stop with these surveillance and reconnaissance operations. The hell with your freedom of navigation operations. Back off. This is our sphere of influence. The Pacific Ocean is big enough for both of us, and if you stay on your side of it,
San
like
Diego.
Hawaii, all right, I was going to say Hawaii, but San Diego,
So it all touch on the Pacific.
you'll be okay. I'm not calling it a game of chicken, but we'd be foolish to project onto the Chinese, our own biases, our own construct. Now, you mentioned a number of other problems. The propensity of the PLA and the security services to, or for that matter, all the ministries, to slam the door shut when the other side does something that they don't like, to pull down all dialogues. They don't see dialogue as a real problem-solving mechanism or a crisis prevention mechanism. They just don't look at it that way. And I tend to think, by and large, they see it as a bargaining chip and as leverage or as a gift. The kerfluffle over Wei Fenghe and Lloyd Austin and who's the right counterpart is a case of American advisors outsmarting themselves. I mean, it's true that if your yardstick is sort of proximity to the commander-in-chief, that, okay, the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission is the guy. But at the same time, the Chinese defense minister is the person who's designated as the counterpart. And you know what? I'm not aware of any defense secretary that went to Beijing to meet with the defense minister who wasn't also able to call on the chairman of the military commission. So like there are smarter and not so smart ways of dealing with this asymmetry. We spent a long time not meeting anybody, which did not particularly benefit us.
It's a great question. The reason I thought you misheard him is when Danny said China's not interested in the guardrails because the guardrails are seen as a way for the United States to more safely pressure China on its periphery. And they don't want the United States to feel safe while it's pressuring China. If you think about INF, it would have been great from our perspective for China to get involved in INF, but they had developed this large arsenal of medium range and longer range conventionally tipped ballistic missiles that would be rolled up by INF if they joined it. So they don't want to join it. They want to threaten us with those things. They don't want stability in that area. So I think that's a persistent problem. But where I do think I would differ a little bit from the most recent exchange with you and Danny is I do believe at the bottom line, and this is in Danny's excellent talk, I don't think either side wants a war. And you said that Xi Jinping and Biden don't want to fight a war. If I didn't believe that, I think the whole situation would be fundamentally different. crisis avoidance and crisis management are a little bit different than war avoidance. And they're related because you could have a crisis spiral out of control, but I don't think either side wants a war. And Ryan Hass has a very nice piece on cross-strait relations on this score, where he says the one thing we still have in common on cross-strait relations is nobody we war. We can work from that foundation and maybe work our way up to a little bit more trust. But if that changes, you know, if Taiwan wants a war, if the United States wants a war, or God forbid the PRC wants a war over Taiwan, then we're likely to have a war. There's not much you can do to bolster it. But fortunately, it appears that no one does.
I agree with you. Not to rain on your parade.
Rain away, you're the guest.
The world history, regrettably, is replete with wars that nobody really wanted. No,
There aren't as many as people think, but there are some, like World War I.
Yeah.
A small one.
So, and Biden was very fond of quoting his father, saying, the only thing worse than a war is an unintended war.
Yeah, sure.
And this was something he was saying to Xi Jinping, 10 years ago. So I do think that there is a certain amount of comfort to be derived from the fact, it's not a fact, but from the belief that neither leader, neither system wants a war. But
It's a limited.
I've seen so much of this kind of mechanical escalation derived from what I think is the security dilemma that it puts me in mind. There's a great scene in a Marx Brothers movie where Groucho Marx is the prime minister of Fredonia, and he's waiting to make peace with his neighboring country, and the prime minister of the other country is on his way over to sign the peace treaty. The war is finally over, and as he's waiting on the steps of the palace, Groucho Marx says to himself, I'm going to extend my hand in friendship and we'll shake, and it's all behind us. But what if I put out my hand and he doesn't take it? I'll be standing there looking like an idiot. At which point the rival leader shows up, puts out his hand, and Groucho Marx slaps him across the face and says, how dare you insult me? So
Yeah. So I don't get me wrong. I think that there's still an increasing chance of conflict, and it worries me all the time. But I do believe that base condition exists, and without that base condition, it'd be much more than word. It would be load up, right?
I agree.
And so we're in a situation that's manageable. So your education and your attention to these things is extremely valuable, because you have a situation where a conflict is not necessary, but it could happen. So that's the perfect place for your expertise to be applied, because a conflict would be a tragedy for everybody. That's my little sermon.
So it's a little after 6. Can we do an online question?
Yeah, do one online question.
Because we still have the food's getting cold. So yeah, that too. So the first question is, if Xi Jinping were not the current president of China right now, would the U.S. relations be fundamentally different in any way? And if so, how? That's the first question. I'm going to ask both real quick and then give it back to you guys. The second question comes, you mentioned various domestic challenges that China is facing at the beginning of your talk. Are most of these challenges mostly domestic, i.e. not going to impact other countries or the global environment, or are some of them potentially things that would impact U.S.-China relations moving forward?
So if not Xi Jinping, well, if it were Bo Xilai, laugh, but it could have been.
It could have been. He had a shot.
Or if it were Li Keqiang. I honestly am not enough of a China expert and not a China scholar to credibly answer the question of what likely would or wouldn't have changed had one or the other, or Hu Jintao for that matter, taken a third and a fourth term. Clearly there are some structural forces at work, and clearly many of the problematic policies from the point of view of the United States had their roots in the Hu Jintao era and really began in the Hu Jintao era. But I think that the expectation, I guess, among the leadership in 2008, 9, 10, was that collective leadership had gone a little too far, and a course correction
Yeah,
was
that's how we
needed.
got Xi Jinping, right?
And that the next leader needed to have more autonomy and more authority, etc. It's hard for me to imagine Li Keqiang being nearly as assertive, breaking so radically from the tradition and the norms. What Bo Xilai would have been like is, of course, a very different question. On the second question about Chinese domestic challenges, look, domestic challenges often drive external policies. And in the case of a country and an economy as big and impactful as China, many of them are virtually guaranteed to spill over and have an effect on the United States, have an effect on the region and the rest of the world. So I don't mean to suggest that there is a category of insular domestic issues that don't matter to the world. Just like US politics is a topic of great interest and usually a considerable amount of either horror or levity on the part of other countries because they are affected by what happens in the United States. China's status as a global power now is in the same category.
So I'd say something about Xi Jinping to answer the online questions. There are certain things that Xi Jinping has done under his leadership that surprised me. Danny referred, sometimes China behaves in surprising fashion, sometimes not. And one of the surprising areas of Xi Jinping's foreign policy has been the speed and intensity of China's increased presence in the South China Sea. Not that China built artificial islands, because other disputants had built artificial islands before, but the intensity of that process and how quickly it unfolded and how militarized the new islands really are in terms of the infrastructure on those islands, clearly designed to project military power in disputed areas in a way that I don't think any old Chinese leader would have done. That's just my sense. And the second thing was in 2019, I was in Taiwan with a Harvard entourage, and Xi Jinping made a speech at New Year's about the 40th anniversary of the letter to the Taiwan compatriots about cross-strait relations. And that speech was surprisingly rigid and strident to me in a way that didn't seem to serve the PRC's interests in cross-strait relations. And that I was in Taiwan at the time. When I arrived in Taiwan, President Tsai Ing-wen's popularity rating was at about 16%. And after President Xi's speech, it was about 38%, and it was rising. Right? So he was doing something that was so in the face of Taiwan, like, we're not backing down, we're going to keep the old principle, we're going to shove them right down your throat. And she became extremely popular. And that and Hong Kong rescued her presidency for the re-election.
Tsai became.
Yeah, Tsai became, she, S-H-E, she became, not C.
Who's on first?
Yeah, she became much more popular in Taiwan. And we interviewed people in both the DPP and the KMT, and you could see the frustration on the faces of the KMT interlocutors that their domestic rival had just been rescued by the mainland in a way that they didn't expect. It was palpable. So those things, I think he is more strident and more assertive than the average CCP leader. But that's just my sense. I can't prove that through a documentary, evidence and do historical process tracing and see if anyone disagreed. It's always a problem too, right? But no one's going to stick their neck out anymore. No one's going to disagree anymore. But I think that speech really ratcheted up cross-strait tensions and made it much harder to get some kind of modus vivendi between the two sides that would reduce tensions.
Well, and to the other question about domestic challenges, that's a great example of how internal politics often lead to policies and decisions that are wildly counterproductive. The United States has experienced no shortage of this.
Yeah. All countries do this, yeah. And sometimes it's because of domestic politics, big forces pushing in those directions. Sometimes it's because of the personality of the individual leader. And I think in this case, it's probably both. But I do think Xi Jinping's different than Hu Jintao in style, in goals. He wants to achieve more in a shorter period of time. And that makes all the problems that Ike raised in his excellent question much more difficult to deal with. Because sometimes you have setbacks, right? In any mission, like you have a long-term mission, there are going to be setbacks. I wonder if Xi Jinping can handle setbacks.
I've heard the theory of Hu Jintao as the engineer and Xi Jinping as the ideologue.
Yeah, but he went to Tsinghua, you know, he should be an engineer. I miss the engineers. Oh, we should turn on the lights.
Thank you, everyone who joined us on Zoom. I'm now going to end the session for all. Please join us next week. We're doing another talk here on October 17th for former ambassador from Vietnam. Have a great night.